The law of self-defense content you are about to enjoy is presented for general educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. If you are in need of legal advice, consult competent legal counsel in the relevant jurisdiction. Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome. Come on in, make yourselves at home. Hopefully you can all hear me. If I could get an audio check in the comments, that would be greatly appreciated. For some reason, I'm not hearing myself through my headphones, but that could be a kind of glitch on my end. So, any indication while everyone's getting seated? Visually, I'm getting a confirmation, but all right, loud and clear. Good. Awesome. Thank you so much, folks. I really appreciate it. So welcome to today's, let me see if I can adjust this a little bit so I forgot to do that beforehand. Welcome to today's Law of Self-Defense News and Q&A show. Try that again. We do these shows every Thursday, or most Thursdays, I should say, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We did miss the last couple of weeks because of travel obligations I had, and it proves difficult on the road to get the streaming capacity I need to do these shows. Oscar, one of our members, is mentioning on the Law of Self-Defense dashboard that he's not seeing anything on Facebook, but it is on Facebook, Oscar. I'm seeing it, and we do have comments there, but thanks for the heads up. I appreciate it. So most Thursdays, we do this Law of Self-Defense News and Q&A show. It is the only open access content we produce each week. Most of our content is restricted to our Law of Self-Defense members. The good news is being a member of Law of Self-Defense is dirt cheap. I'll talk more about that later. It's only about a quarter a day to be a member and access the many thousands of hours of content we've produced and of course, new content just about every day of the week on self-defense law. Now, I do want to emphasize we do use of force law here. We don't do gun law. We're happy to take your questions on use of force law live here during the show, or if you wish, email them ahead of time to show@lawofselfdefense.com. But they ought to be use of force law questions. When are you permitted to use what degree of force under what circumstance in defense of yourself, others, or property? We don't do gun law. So what permits you may require, what guns you're permitted to have or not have if you're unfortunate enough to live in one of the hard gun control states. Gun law is a completely separate area of the law. We don't cover that. I know about as much gun law as I need to know as a law-abiding American citizen who's armed and owns guns and carries guns for personal protection, but I don't claim any particular expertise in gun law. Use of force law, I'll claim some modest degree of expertise. So during the show itself, if you have questions that come to mind, I encourage you to put them in the comments. If you're a Law of Self-Defense member, you're probably watching this on your member dashboard. If you're watching on Facebook Live, then you can put your comments in there. I have them here as well, and periodically I'll take a look at the comments. Now, today's show is a little different than the norm. Normally, I cover some news events, use of force news events I've seen in the news that caught my interest, and then I'll answer questions. What I'd like to do today is something a little different, and it may get me in trouble, folks. So if you don't see me on Facebook for a while, it's because this show got me in trouble with Facebook. What I'd like to do is share some videos with you that are from the internet. And there's always a possibility that someone will complain that I'm using their video, that I'll get some kind of copyright strike. It's hard to predict those things. It's why I usually avoid videos to avoid that potential problem. These are very short videos. They're only about a minute each. I'd like to think that they qualify as fair use for copyright purposes, but fair use is an admittedly rather subjective and ambiguous safe harbor for this kind of thing. But we'll try it today. We'll see what happens. If I get a timeout on Facebook, you'll know this is the reason why. So we have a number of those videos, and then time permitting. Well, first of all, after each video, I'll be happy to take questions. I'll look in the comments for those. And then after we've gone through, let's say I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of these videos, then I'm happy to take questions generally on any use of force topic you'd care to post up. Let's see. Before I jump into the substance of today's show, I do feel obliged, of course, to mention our sponsor, which is CCW Safe, a provider of legal service memberships, what many people mistakenly call self-defense insurance. In effect, they promise to pay their members' legal expenses if the member is involved in a use of force event. Also, red flag law events, folks. Very important coverage. Now, it's very easy, folks, to find yourself in legal trouble for having engaged in a use or threat of force, even if you believe that use or threat of force was lawful, even if it was, in fact, lawful. And these legal consequences get very expensive very quickly. If you merely display a gun or make someone aware that you have a gun for purposes of changing their behavior because you perceive them as a threat, stay back, I'll defend myself. Well, a prosecutor could argue with a straight face that qualifies as aggravated assault with a firearm, putting someone else in imminent fear of deadly harm, which you would then have to justify as self-defense, raise a legal defense. But if you're facing an aggravated assault with a firearm charge, folks, you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars in legal expenses before you go to trial, and just multiply that for trial. If you've actually killed someone in self-defense and you're facing a manslaughter or murder charge, very easy to go through a couple of $100,000 pre-trial legal expense, folks. So it's very helpful to have a partner standing behind you to provide the kinds of resources you need if you want to fight that legal battle the way it ought to be fought, and that is as if the rest of your life depends on it, because really, folks, it does. And that's what CCW Safe promises to do for its members. Now, as you might imagine, I've looked at all these various quote-unquote self-defense insurance offerings out there. Some of them are okay. Some of them suck, frankly. I found that CCW Safe is the best fit for me by a large margin. I'm personally a member of CCW Safe. My wife, Emily, is personally a member of CCW Safe. I think those folks do a great job. That's why I'm a member. Whether or not they're the best fit for you is something only you can decide, but I do encourage you to take a look at what they have to offer by pointing your browser after the show to lawofselfdefense.com/CCW Safe. And if you do decide to become a member of CCW Safe at that URL, you can save 10% off your membership with them using the discount code LOSD10. That's LOSD for Law of Self-Defense and the number 10. Okay, so let's get back to the show proper then. And I'll share the first of these videos I have for you. Now, this video, I came across it because it was posted by Greg Douglas on Facebook. It's not his image. He's not involved in these events. He simply found it interesting video that he'd come across. I think it was originally posted on Instagram, given the square format of the video. And Greg found it interestingly enough to post up on his Facebook page, and I find it interesting enough to comment on. Basically, it involves an apparent exercise, gun pistol exercise at an outdoor range. We have a gentleman in a hat who's doing the shooting. He's shooting at one of these plastic molded white kind of three-dimensional targets, humanoid targets, from the waist up targets, torso and head, and positioned about halfway in front of the target as if they were being held hostage by the target is an actual human being of questionable intelligence and judgment, but nevertheless, he's playing the role of hostage, and the gentleman who's doing the shooting is shooting past the hostage's head at the target's head. So I'm going to show you that video now, and then we can do a little commentary on it, and I'll take any questions that you happen to have. So let me pull some of this stuff down, and I think it'll just play right in the middle of the screen. There's no audio, folks. I don't think there's audio. There should only be video. Here we go. Okay, and that's the video. Now, the first thing I'd like to say is I'm not telling anyone not to engage in this kind of training, is that if that's what you want to do. It's not my job to tell you what to do. I will say you'll never see me doing this because there's substantial, obvious physical risks involved, perhaps somewhat less obvious legal risks involved that I'll share with you in a moment. And there's no offsetting benefit. The ability to hit a head-sized target can be practiced without endangering an innocent person's life. It's practice. That's what practice is for. So I just don't see any substantive benefit that comes from doing this exercise that's worth the risks involved. But if you see it, I mean, feel free. It's a free country for a while, to go yet, I guess. But let's talk about some of the risks. Obviously, there's physical risk, right? The human being playing the role of hostage could easily catch that round in the head. Plenty of us, I mean, those of us who shoot competitively, there's lots of stages where there's headshots. Lots of headshots are missed. There's lots of stages where you have obscuring hardcover or obscuring hostage-type cardboard targets. And a lot of those targets, the good guy targets, the hostage targets, the no-shoot targets, end up with bullet holes in them, right? There's no guarantee the round's going to hit the bad guy's head, quote-unquote bad guy's head, as is intended. So there's a risk to the guy playing hostage that he's going to catch around the head and end up dead. First rule of the morning, folks, every morning, don't get dead. That's rule number one. And again, there's no offsetting benefit here. There are circumstances in which some of us might be willing to risk our lives, but it ought to be for a good reason, not because some other dude would like to practice his hostage headshot skill level. Unless he wants to do that. You want to play the hostage in this role, I guess, feel free. You might want to take out a life insurance and make law of self-defense a beneficiary. That would be greatly appreciated. But other than that, it's up to you, I suppose. What about the legal risks for the gentleman doing the shooting? Well, obviously, if he shoots the hostage through the head and kills a human being under these circumstances, it's probably not murder. He probably did not intend to shoot that person through the head, probably intended to shoot the target through the head, but it's certainly manslaughter. Certainly involuntary manslaughter. He's knowingly creating a risk of death, unjustified risk of death to another person, engaging in conduct that creates that risk and ignoring that apparent and known risk. If a person dies as a result, that's classic felony involuntary manslaughter, good for 20 years in prison in most jurisdictions. Maybe more because there's likely to be a firearm sentencing enhancement, for example. So that's if he kills the hostage. What if he doesn't kill the hostage? What about if it happened just like it happened in the video? The bullet goes where intended. It hits the target's head. No injury whatever to the gentleman playing the hostage. Is that a crime? Yeah, it's a crime. It's called felony reckless endangerment. You're recklessly, for no good reason, you're not actually saving someone's life by making this effort. There's no offsetting meaningful benefit that's comparable to creating a risk to innocent human life. You're engaged in felony reckless endangerment. The same kind of charge can be brought if you fire, quote unquote, warning shots into the air, for example, during a confrontation. If you discharge shots into the ground for the same purpose, you're sending rounds out into the universe that could easily harm an innocent person. You're endangering human life recklessly. You know you're creating that danger. You're doing it anyway, and there's no offsetting benefit comparable to the risk that you're creating. So this guy doing the shooting here, of course, in the actual video, they fuzz out his face. But I mean, if the authorities were able to identify him, and assuming, of course, always on the assumption this occurred in the U.S., I have no idea where this might have taken place. But in the U.S., this would be classic felony reckless endangerment, despite the lack of injury to anybody, including the man playing, the gentleman playing hostage in this scenario. So if you want to engage in these kinds of exercises, I guess it's up to you and whoever you're partnered with. But those are the legal risks you're incurring by doing that. I can tell you this, you won't find me doing this. I would suggest it's probably a very valuable skill to be able to hit a head-sized target under stress around that may be surrounded by things you don't want to shoot. But there's no reason not to develop that skill set under circumstances where you're not endangering human life. Okay. By the way, of course, as always, this video could have been entirely faked. I have no idea, but for purposes of discussion, I'm presuming that it was in some respects real. So let me see if you have any comments on that particular video. Let's see. I'll be happy to take a look at that. Oscar has a question about use of force in the home, but I think I'll save that, Oscar, because several of the videos I'm going to share with you, in fact, all the rest involve use of force in the home videos. So I'll probably address your question as we step through that. Let's see. In the Facebook comments, welcome everybody. Welcome. Good to see both a lot of the usual names and some new ones as well. So folks, if you have a question not related to that video, I will circle back and come back to it before the end of the show, time permitting. Right now, I'm just looking at questions relating to the video. Yeah, someone's suggesting this is one of those insane Russian training videos. Could be, and I don't know what the laws are in Russia by any means. Let's see. All right. So that was that first video. Now the second video involves a kid. I believe he's 10 or 11 or 12 years old. I forget the exact age, who finds himself dealing with an intruder, a thief who unlawfully enters his home, and the kid retrieves a gun to defend himself against his intruder. And in all these videos, folks, I want to make clear that all of these involve someone in a home. The next three videos I'll share with you involve someone in the home dealing with a genuine intruder and a genuine and realistic perception that they're facing a deadly force threat. And I certainly don't mean to suggest in any of these videos that I'd rather the bad guy had won the day, but there sometimes were mistakes made in these videos. So I'd just like to point those out. Under the circumstances, I certainly would not expect the authorities to press hard on these mistakes, as we'll see. But technical mistakes are sometimes made even in these feel-good defensive home videos where children are acting well above their pay level for sure, but maybe haven't been educated to the degree they need to be able to do that with the expertise we'd really like, at least from a legal perspective. So let me play the first of these for you. It's a young boy. These are not new videos, by the way, folks. I pulled them up. So you may have seen these previously, but I'll play them for you and then we'll comment upon it. So here's the first of these. Kid defends himself in his home from a thief intruder in the home.
11-year-old Chris Gaither was home alone Wednesday morning when he heard a noise. Someone had broken into his house. Scared, Chris grabbed a 9mm handgun.
When he was coming downstairs and told me he was going to kill me and F you, all that.
The intruder made it out the front door with a hamper in hand. That's when Chris started firing off bullets. As the intruder was to jump this fence, Chris's 12th and final shot hit the bad guy in the leg.
I shot through a hamper that he was carrying, and it was a full metal jacket bullet. I went straight to the back and hit him in his leg. And he started crying like a little baby.
A baby that learned his lesson.
When I pulled the gun out on him, I guess he didn't think it was a real gun because he didn't worry about it. He just kept on walking.
The police have not released the name of the suspect, but Chris's mother says this man has robbed their house before. They don't know him personally. Chris credits his stepdad for his shooting skills.
Yeah, I play zombies for target practice.
Turns out there's more than a basset hound on guard.
I hope you learned a lesson from coming to this house trying to steal stuff.
All right, so certainly a feel-good story. The kid won the day. The bad guy got an extra hole for his efforts. But of course, there's an obvious technical legal problem with this use of force, and that is that this boy, and by the way, kudos to his stepdad for teaching him all the gun stuff. No question about that. He clearly knows how to operate a 9mm pistol. He knows what a full metal jacket round is. He hit his target with at least one of those rounds that he fired. I'm not sure how many misses there were. That would be less than optimal, obviously. But kudos to stepdad for making sure the boy has the physical capabilities, the operational capabilities to use a firearm to defend himself in his home. The technical difficulty, of course, is that the shot that struck the bad guy, and perhaps all the rounds that were fired after the bad guy was out of the house, apparently departing with a laundry hamper full of stolen goods. This was not Texas. I believe this was Alabama. I believe it was outside Talladega. But in any case, it was not Texas, and therefore there is no privilege to use deadly force in defense of mere personal property. And at the time these shots were fired, That's all there was to attempt to justify use of force, defense of property. There was no longer an intrusion into the home. There was no longer a threat to person, a threat to the kid in particular. Now, if the kid had lit up the bad guy inside the home, clearly it would have been a justified use of deadly defensive force. You have a forceful, unlawful intruder into the home, likely triggers a legal presumption of a reasonable perception of a deadly force harm at the hands of that intruder. Most states have such provisions. But even absent such a provision, it's a genuine intruder in the home committing burglary, felony, a forcible felony justifiable in every jurisdiction for the use of deadly defensive force, absent, for example, the burglar simply throwing up his hands and surrendering in the moment. But otherwise, lawful use of deadly defensive force, no requirement to shout a warning, no requirement to say, get out of my house, drop the stuff, anything like that. They're a felony burglar in your home. They are a deadly force threat unless there's clear and convincing evidence to the contrary. That would have been fine. This was not, technically speaking, a lawful use of deadly defensive force. Now, this is a kid. I don't expect outside of Talladega, he's likely to face serious legal pressure here. But if it were you or me or an adult who'd engaged in this conduct, and say, for example, the person who was leaving with a laundry hamper full of goods was a 15-year-old male of a different race or ethnicity, you might well find a politically motivated prosecutor to press hard on that legal defect. You shot him in the back as they were fleeing with your property, but property is not sufficient to justify the use of deadly defensive force. We would find ourselves very hard-pressed about that use of deadly defensive force under circumstances where technically it was not justifiable. Again, I don't mean to suggest that I would have preferred a different outcome than the child here being successful in defending himself. It would have been better, probably, if he hadn't fired that departing shot. He expresses the desire, the hope that this thief will have learned his lesson. In my experience, they rarely do. There's plenty of thieves out there with multiple bullet wounds from different escapades. In any case, that's not our responsibility to teach other people lessons. We have use of force privileges to defend ourselves, others against deadly force harm, and with less than deadly force and everywhere besides Texas to defend our property similarly, not to teach people lessons. Okay, let me scroll through here. Yeah, also wrong type of bullet, George points that out. But of course, it's a kid. You know, he's probably stuck with the gun and the round that's loaded in the gun. Let's see. All right. I don't see any more questions on that. But if they come in delayed, I'll still be happy to address. Here's a question from Philip. I think it might be on Facebook. Philip O. It might refer to the previous video where we had the shooting in the hostage-taking scenario. Philip asked, do police have the same exact liability, reckless endangerment for the same scenario? I'm not sure what you mean by the same scenario. If you mean exactly this, if they had an officer play the role of hostage in front of a target, inanimate target, and another officer was doing the headshot to the hostage taker exercise and put a round through the officer hostage's head, yes. Even if he didn't put a round, he's creating a risk of reckless endangerment. So if there's a department in the U.S. running this exercise, which I certainly hope there's not, but yes, that would be the same liability for reckless endangerment. Wouldn't make any difference. It's reckless endangerment because there's no offsetting justification. There's no equivalent benefit being achieved comparable to the serious prospect of a loss of human life. Okay, so let's go on to another video involving a child using a gun to defend their home. This one happens to be a girl. She appears to be about the same age as the boy we just watched, but under somewhat different circumstances. Let me pull this down, pull up the video, and here we go.
He opened the screen door and started pounding on the door, so I didn't answer it, and I called my mom. And she said to get the gun and go hide in the closet.
I'm at my house. I'm at my closet, no matter what. And somebody's trying to get in my house, and I do not know who they are.
Okay, I have a deputy en route. I want you to stay on the phone with me, okay?
Okay, please. I think they're in the house.
Knowing her daughter was in danger, Deborah St. Clair raced home from work.
I drove home at a really fast pace to try to get to her, and when I got here, the police were already here, and they had the suspect.
That's because St. Clair's daughter shot the intruder as he made his way through the house.
When I saw the door handle turn, I shot him. I guess it went through the door and went through him and went through the wall.
The bullet hit the intruder and he took off, but he only made it a short ways down the road.
Okay, so I'm back. Let's put this stuff back up here. So we had the 12-year-old girl, or however her age, I don't recall. Young girl at home by herself. Somebody's breaking into the house. She calls her mom. Mom's off at work, presumably, starts racing home. Guess what, folks? Mom's not getting home in time to make any difference, right? I'm not saying she shouldn't race home, but that's not going to make the difference. The girl calls 911, and guess what, folks? 911's not going to get there in time to make a difference either when you're dealing with an intruder actually breaching into the home. Whoever's in the home is going to have to defend themselves in the moment. The police, I presume, will be happy to show up, do what they can, draw the chalk lines, but it's over. All but the shouting by that point. And same with mom getting home. So here, the girl had an option besides being simply defenseless and waiting for people to arrive too late to help her. She had an actual gun she could access. And by the way, folks, this is one of the reasons I'm opposed to these mandatory lock the guns up laws that exist in many states, mostly blue states, but not only blue states. And it's for reasons like this. Now, I'll preface that by saying anybody who allows an unauthorized person to access their firearms and harm results, well, you should expect to be held responsible. Guns are inherently dangerous instruments. It's up to you. You're responsible for making sure harm doesn't result. But if you live in a home with children who are mature enough, in your opinion, to handle firearms for purposes of personal protection, I don't see any reason why those children should not have access to those firearms. Obviously, if your judgment is poor, and their judgment turns out to be poor, and they do bad things with those guns, you should expect to be held responsible. But I can tell you that I had my own personal firearms, mostly a 22 caliber firearms, and particularly a rifle, at the age of 9. And I would go out into the woods and plink to my heart's content. I lived in an area where you could do that. And my family, there was never any concern that I was going to shoot somebody or commit a crime or negligently harm somebody with that firearm, because I'd been taught and trained, even as a child, even at that age, to safely handle and use firearms independently of adult supervision. Now, again, I don't do gun law, so I don't know what the laws in your jurisdiction may be in terms of when a child is allowed to access a firearm. I can tell you that under these kinds of circumstances, even if it were technically unlawful for a child to be in possession of a firearm at a particular age, the legal defense to any such legal allegation or charge would be the doctrine of necessity. In other words, yes, perhaps a wrong was committed, but it was done to prevent a much greater harm, and therefore the conduct is excusable. The alleged wrong is excusable. This is the same doctrine that would permit you to, say, break a car window on a hot day to save a child who's been locked inside the car, save the child from overheating and dying inside the car. Sure, breaking the car window is normally wrong. It's destruction of someone else's property, but you're committing a small harm to prevent a much greater harm. So a child accessing a gun under circumstances that would normally be unlawful to prevent a home intruder, with all the presumptions that follow of that intruder being present to commit felonies or deadly force harm to those inside the structure, that clearly is a much greater harm that's being avoided by the commission of a much lesser harm. And that's what the doctrine of necessity allows. Sometimes it's called the doctrine of lesser harms. It's a very, very old legal doctrine, hundreds of years old, really. So it goes under different terms in different states, but every state has some similar provision. But I will say you better be sure you're right about your child being responsible enough, having sufficient judgment to have that responsibility. Accessing firearms is a big responsibility. But in states that have these mandatory lock up your gun so your kids can't get it laws, well, this girl would have had no protection against this intruder, and we wouldn't have this happy ending. Another facet of this I'd like to touch upon is the notion, it appears that the girl actually shot the intruder through the door. In other words, he wasn't yet in the same room as her. She says she saw the doorknob turn, and that's when she discharged the gun, and the round struck the bad guy so he could flee wounded and be picked up by the police down the street. Many of us may have been taught to never do that, never shoot through a closed door. And as a blanket statement, I would suggest it's not quite right, because the real criteria is whether or not you're using that defensive force in a reasonable manner. Now, if all you heard was a knock on your front door and you shot through it, that would not be a reasonable use of deadly force. Where are the other elements of self-defense? Remember, the elements of self-defense are required elements of self-defense. They're cumulative. They must be present for your use of force to be legally justified. Those elements, by the way, for those of you who may be new to law of self-defense, I don't keep them a big secret. They are the 5 elements of innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. We actually have a free infographic we make available to the public. You can get it here at lawofselfdefense.com/elements. It doesn't cost a penny, folks. It lists the 5 elements for you, provides a free description of those. If you're not familiar with these 5 elements of self-defense, and they apply in all 50 states, folks. If you're not familiar with these 5 elements of self-defense, then you don't really understand use of force law, because these are the building blocks of use of force law. So I urge you to familiarize yourself with these. Now, I will say it's up to 5 elements. It's up to these, and they are innocence, imminence, proportionality, avoidance, and reasonableness. Sometimes not all 5 are required. Sometimes an element may be legally waived for some reason. For example, most states are stand your ground states. So generally speaking, you don't have a legal duty to retreat. Generally speaking, the element of avoidance would not apply in those jurisdictions. There are exceptions, of course, where avoidance could be reacquired as an element that you have to have in order for your use of force to be lawful self-defense. But the most of the elements you'll have is these 5. That's the maximum. You may have fewer. And that's good news. The good news is there are not 500 elements of a claim of self-defense or 50 elements of a claim of self-defense. There's only 5. So it's not rocket science, folks, but you do need to know what they are. Most of the cases I work on, I consult on, are cases in which it's a law-abiding American citizen, never been in serious trouble with the law in their lives, genuinely, subjectively believes they were using or threatening force in lawful self-defense, but in fact, they were technically ignorant of these 5 elements of self-defense. They accidentally, not through malice, but through ignorance, violated one of those elements, and therefore they lost self-defense as a legal justification. And when I say that they did this out of ignorance, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, folks. I mean it in a technical sense. They're not stupid people. They just don't know. They were never properly taught use of force law, no matter what kind of concealed carry class they may have taken. Most people teaching this stuff don't really know what use of force law. Most of them are repeating internet nonsense that they themselves were taught, and they're not teaching bad information out of malice either. They've never had the opportunity to get a really well-grounded in the law, the actual law, education in use of force law themselves. They're doing the best they can, but unfortunately they often pass on bad information. So get that infographic, 5 elements of self-defense law, at lawofselfdefense.com/elements. Again, it's totally free, folks. So let me get back to this shooting through the door scenario. If there are circumstances in which it's virtually certain that the person on the other side of that door is threatening you with deadly offensive force, unlawful deadly offensive force, and the threat is imminent. Now, you might argue that, hey, if the door is locked, how can the threat be imminent? They have to at least get through the door first. But in this circumstance, apparently the door wasn't locked. She saw the doorknob turn, and that was enough for her to believe the door was about to be opened. Do you absolutely have to let the person in the room with you before you can shoot in self-defense? And I would suggest the answer is no. Say you had observed the aggressor approaching your home, for example, or you knew they were already in the home and you ran to a safe room and you knew they were armed with a firearm. Well, you don't have to wait for them to open that door and stick their gun around the edge of the door and start shooting at you before you can defend yourself. What you need to have is a reasonable perception of an imminent deadly force threat. You know they have a gun. You know the doorknob's turning. That could well be sufficient to justify your immediate use of deadly defensive force. Are you shooting through a door? Yes. Does that have risks? Yes. Anytime you're discharging your firearm in self-defense, there's risks. There's risks you could miss. There's risks you could overpenetrate. There's never if you're discharging a gun, there's never a zero risk scenario. There's a risk always. The question is not, is there risk? The question is the risk reasonable under the circumstances? Now, I'm certainly not advocating shooting through doors under every circumstance. That would be insane. But it's also clearly true that there are circumstances in which shooting through the door could be the reasonable response to an imminent deadly force threat. Let's see if there was anything. I think that's all I wanted to comment upon there. Now I have another video to share with all of you. Let's see if there's any questions about that. For those of you saying that you got to notice that this was canceled, that's not Facebook's fault. That's my fault. So every once in a while, we try to tweak with our streaming technology. The technology we normally use is rather independent of Facebook. It's kind of a blind stream to Facebook. That's our normal practice. This morning, we tried to schedule this on Facebook so people would get notifications ahead of time. And that worked. We got it scheduled on Facebook, but then we couldn't connect our streaming system on my end to the scheduled Facebook event. And because they couldn't connect, I was not going to be able to stream to that scheduled event. So we deleted the scheduled event. So that was us. Hopefully we can get that figured out so folks will get notifications through the Facebook system about things and we'll be able to stream to those pre-notified events. But we haven't been able to figure it out yet. So the apparent cancellation of the show today was error on our part, not an effort by Facebook to censor us. Not that I imagine that Facebook would hesitate to censor us. I'm amazed every week that we still have a Facebook page, but there you go. Okay, let's see. Any questions on that? Bruce here on Facebook says, we had someone in the area who had an intruder in her home. The person came through an unlocked door. She engaged the intruder with a firearm and held him for police. Many folks have told her she should have shot him. So engaged with a firearm, I guess, meant a mere threat of force. Folks have indicated you need to shoot if you display a firearm. Well, no, you don't need to shoot if you display a firearm by any means. Remember, folks, the mission is to neutralize the threat. If you can neutralize the threat by running away, you've neutralized the threat if they're no longer an imminent threat to you. That's a great way to win a fight, is to not have to fight. If you can neutralize the threat by merely making them aware you have the means to defend yourself without having to use that force upon them, that's in your interest. You want to use the least degree of force that you have to, consistent, of course, with securing your safety and the safety of others you have a duty to protect. So the least degree of force that's required to do that. If you have to shoot them in order to secure your safety, the safety of others you have a duty to protect, then that's what you have to do. But if you don't, it's in your interest not to do that. Frankly, if you're dealing with a forcible, unlawful intruder in your home, the prospects of getting in legal trouble for having shot them are pretty minuscule, unless you do something really silly like shoot them in the back as they're fleeing, for example, tie them up and then shoot them. I know that sounds insane, but folks, those things happen, believe it or not. If you set up an ambush and put out bait for intruders to come in and then shoot them, that's not self-defense, folks. That's not defensive dwelling. So, but if you don't do any of those insane things, a forcible and unlawful intruder into your home, that's a very difficult situation to find yourself prosecuted for. Unless it smells bad, unless there's facts that suggest a motive other than defense of home. for the shooting. If it's an ex-spouse or a boyfriend or a business partner you don't like, obviously that would tend to rebut the otherwise existing presumption that you genuinely had a reasonable fear of harm from this person. But otherwise, a forcible, unlawful entry into your home, defending yourself against that person, is about as clean a use of defensive force as you can have. Now, generally, it does need to be forcible. So in the question or the scenario Bruce posed here, he mentions the intruder came through an unlocked door. Folks, please lock your doors. And this also raises the issue that often legal terms often have very different meanings in different legal contexts. So, for example, for those of you who may be familiar with this concept because you're in law enforcement or perhaps an attorney, for purpose of breaking and entering law, for the crime of breaking and entering, it's not really required that something be broken. What's required is that the plane of the home is broken. If they step through an open doorway, they've broken the plane into your home. That's sufficient for breaking and entering. For use of force law purposes, a forcible entry generally requires something was actually broken to get in. That's what you need. And that's because we're always concerned about the possibility of what we call an innocent intruder, someone who's present unlawfully, but not with malice. An innocent intruder, a repairman sent to the wrong home, or your neighbor's out-of-town visitor who walks into essentially an identical home. They think they're in the right place, but they're in your house, not the place they're supposed to be. So for use of force law purposes, before you can shoot someone, the law is concerned about that concept, that risk of the innocent intruder. But there's no innocent explanation for why somebody broke something to get into your home, right? A repairman sent to the wrong address isn't breaking something to get into the wrong address to fix a dishwasher. So when you have a forcible entry, it removes that possibility of ambiguity. When someone steps through an open doorway, though, that ambiguity still exists. So I urge you, lock your doors, keep your doors locked. And it doesn't have to be a safe level lock. A little hook through a ring, like many of us, if you're of my age, perhaps used to have on screen doors. If they break that, that's enough. That's a forcible entry. Arm strength can break that, but they had to break something to get in. So keep your doors locked. Now, I understand that's not realistic for many people. I've got 4 kids. You got kids in your home. It's almost impossible to get them to keep stuff locked, to keep garage doors closed. I get it. But to the extent you can, you owe it to yourself, if someone's going to unlawfully enter your home, to compel them to break something in order to gain access, because it removes that possible ambiguity. But no, you don't need to shoot someone simply because you've displayed a gun. In fact, there's a lot of circumstances in which display of the gun would be legally justified. Actually firing the shot would be not. So again, use the minimal force required consistent with securing your safety. Don't increase your jeopardy unnecessarily. You're not required to risk death in order to in the course of defending yourself and your home against an intruder. But if the circumstances are such where you believe you have the luxury of not having to shoot and still keeping yourself safe, then that's the course I would advise you to take, is to not fire the shot. Let's see. Yeah, so Lance here on Facebook asks, with the video with the boy who shot at the intruder when the intruder was leaving, there is, of course, another possible risk of liability here. The video suggests he fired rounds, maybe a dozen or so rounds, only one of which hit the intruder. All those other rounds went somewhere else. Now, the risk we face there, the potential legal charge, assuming the rounds didn't actually hit anybody. If they hit somebody, you have a bigger problem. But even if the rounds didn't hit somebody, you run a risk of reckless endangerment, just like we talked about in the hostage video. You start throwing rounds around, and those rounds, there's no such thing as a miss, really, right, folks? The round continues until it hits something. So it's going to hit something. You're creating a risk to others. It's a bullet. It's a deadly force risk. Recklessly creating a risk of danger to others is felony. A risk of death or serious bodily harm is felony reckless endangerment. It's a very serious charge. And like most of these charges, it could well carry a firearm sentencing enhancement, which often the enhancement for the gun often carries more time in prison than the underlying criminal charge. So you could be looking at a great deal of time, 10 years in Florida, even 20 years, or potentially life for a firearm sentencing enhancement is a real thing, independent of the underlying criminal charge, just the gun sentencing enhancement. So this is something to be concerned about. Now, whether or not there was created a reckless risk to human life depends in large part upon the circumstances. So if you're in a city or a crowded suburb, lots of houses on half-acre lots, everybody's in close proximity, well, a round fired is, has a real likelihood of hitting a human being. If you live in a much more rural setting, on a 100-acre farm, well, you could fire a lot of rounds into the air with relatively little prospect of causing harm to others. So all of that would be taken into consideration in making a admittedly somewhat subjective determination of whether or not the firing of those rounds qualified as reckless endangerment. Now, that's also balanced, of course, against the justification for firing the rounds. So if someone's actively shooting at you and you're actively shooting back, and maybe under the stress of the moment, your aim's not what you'd like it to be, and a bunch of rounds miss, even those misses can be justifiable. Even if they strike an innocent bystander, they may still be justifiable. Certainly, we all know that police involved in gunfights often fire rounds that miss, and it seems particularly prone to NYPD, fire rounds that miss and hit innocent bystanders, and they're not criminally charged for those bullet rounds hitting innocent bystanders. So it can be justified, but there has to be that offsetting benefit. Here we have a fleeing thief. That's not going to be an offsetting benefit. You're not risking human life because you're trying to save a human life. That would be the balance. You're risking human life by recklessly firing rounds into the air. Rather, the rounds fired into the air, the misses are reckless because there's no offsetting, roughly equivalent benefit of saving a human life for having risked a human life. Now, whether a child would be charged with that in some suburb of Talladega, I mean, there's obviously political components there too. But certainly, if you're an adult firing rounds into the air, you should not be surprised if you're charged with reckless endangerment. This often comes up, by the way, in the context of defensive pet scenarios. Someone's walking their dog's attacked by some other dog. They fire a round at the other dog or a round into the ground to scare the other dog away, the attacking dog away. And then you have to ask yourself, well, where's the balance there? So you fired a round that potentially will go on until it hits somebody, perhaps a human being. If it's a crowded area with lots of other people, you've endangered those other people. Is that endangerment of other human beings with a bullet, deadly force endangerment, is it balanced against a roughly equivalent benefit? And the law does not consider your dog. I know you consider your dog of human-like value as a member of your family, but the law does not consider your pet to be of equivalent value to a human being. So that you were defending your dog against, even assume the attack upon the dog was a lethal attack. If you were defending your pet against death, but endangering human life in doing that, that's not a justifiable risk that's being created. That would be reckless endangerment. And often people walking their dogs, something like this happens, they discharge rounds from their gun, they end up charged and convicted of reckless endangerment. And it's generally a felony, folks. So let's see. So John here asks, would a Good Samaritan law apply in defending a stranger if an innocent bystander was struck? So if you're defending yourself or someone else, it's really equivalent for these purposes. Let's say you're defending yourself, because it really doesn't make any difference. You're being attacked by someone charging you with a machete, clearly an imminent deadly force attack. You're the innocent party. They're the aggressor. All the conditions of, let's even assume there's no safe avenue of retreat. So all the elements for self-defense are met, right? Let's presume for purposes of discussion. You're firing rounds into that person charging you with the machete, 100% legally justifiable use of deadly defensive force. Every element of self-defense has been met in your favor. And one of those rounds misses. One of those rounds overpenetrates, whatever, goes on to strike an innocent bystander who did nothing to deserve getting shot by you. How the law is supposed to treat that is using a doctrine that's called the Doctrine of Transferred Intent. And normally the Doctrine of Transferred Intent is applied in circumstances where the intent involved is bad. So imagine a bad guy is shooting at you. He's trying to kill you, firing rounds at you. He has murderous intent towards you. And one of his rounds, all his rounds miss you, thankfully. Unfortunately, one of them continues on, hits an innocent bystander, kills the innocent bystander. Now, the person attacking you never had any intent to hurt anybody else. They had no murderous intent towards the person who ended up getting struck by an errant round. But what the law says is the murderous intent they had towards you gets transferred to that innocent bystander so that the person trying to kill you can be charged with the crime of murder for the killing of the innocent bystander, even though they had no intent to kill that innocent bystander. Their intent to kill you transfers over to that innocent bystander. They can be charged and convicted for murder for that person's death. Well, transferred intent also works with good intent. If your intent in firing the rounds at the bad guy was a just legally justified, genuinely good intent, there's no malice there, there's no criminal conduct there, and you're firing those rounds responsibly, by which I mean non-negligently, then your good intent in firing those rounds at the genuine bad guy carries over to an innocent bystander who may be unfortunately struck by one of those rounds. Now, it is required that you're firing those rounds responsibly, non-negligently. So if you just stick a gun around a corner and discharge a bunch of rounds, or over the hood of your car, or close your eyes and fire blindly, or do a mag dump, or you're firing from the hip and you don't have any reason to believe you can hit anything reliably, firing from the hip under the circumstances involved. Well, if you're discharging the rounds negligently, then transferred intent is not going to help you. That's, again, it's simply recklessly discharging those rounds. It would be then a case of involuntary manslaughter, reckless killing of another human being, not justifiable because of your underlying negligence. Self-defense can't be negligent and lawful, folks. If your use of force is negligent, it's not lawful self-defense. Okay. Sarah Hento asks, separate from these videos, can I clarify the distinction between brandishing and open carry? Unfortunately, these tend to be very fact-sensitive cases. So brandishing normally involves handling the gun in a manner that's threatening to another person. Simply walking around with a holstered gun does not do that, ought not do that. But it very quickly can change to threatening. So you're open carrying, the gun's in the holster, and you perceive something threatening and you tell the person, stay back, and clearly they can see your gun because you're open carrying. Have you now threatened them? Certainly if someone was robbing you and opened up their coat so you could see their gun and said, give me your money, you've been threatened with a gun, right? They're making you aware of the gun for purpose of changing their behavior. If you're open carrying and you tell someone to stay back, are you threatening them with a gun for purpose of changing their behavior? They can see the gun. It's one of the reasons I'm not a fan of open carry for me personally. I think every law-abiding American citizen has the absolute constitutional right to open carry. Don't get me wrong. But I think it opens the door to hassles and legal complications that personally I'd rather not have to deal with. If I'm carrying concealed, as is my practice, nobody knows I have the gun unless they need to know I have the gun. And if they need to know I have the gun, it's because it's under circumstances where making them aware I have the gun would be legally justified. When the gun's just open carried, other people can make all kinds of allegations about what your demeanor was, your conduct, your tone of voice, was it threatening? All so very subjective and hard to refute after the fact. So it can be it can become very ambiguous whether or not you were engaged in threatening behavior or not. At the extremes, it's not ambiguous, but we never get in trouble on the extremes. If all you're doing is minding your own business, not interacting with anybody, you're simply open carrying, that's clearly not brandishing in a threatening manner. At the other extreme, if you're telling someone, get get away. I have a gun. I'm prepared to use it. Unless, circumstances, the elements of self-defense would legally justify that kind of conduct. Sure, there could be aggravated assault with a firearm. You don't need to touch the gun for it to be aggravated assault with a firearm. You just have to have put that other person in reasonable fear of imminent deadly force harm without justification. So those are the extremes. Well-informed, law-abiding people don't tend to get in trouble on those extremes. But there's that big middle between those two extremes, what I call the zone of ambiguity, where there is legal risk. Remember, ultimately, other human beings are going to decide your legal fate. A jury, right? Before them, a judge, a prosecutor, police officers. But these are all human beings who are subject to rhetoric and argument and convincing, and not everyone's, there's an average intelligence for a reason, right? Half the population's above it, half the population's below it. That's what average means. You don't know what your jury's going to look like. You don't know if a prosecutor might be politically motivated to charge you. You don't know if an officer might feel, hey, haven't made an arrest in a while. Let's do this one, then kick it down the pipeline. It's someone else's problem. So I prefer personally to put myself in the most legally conservative position possible. And for me, that means open carry is off the table. Now, if the only way you can carry is open carry, then if the only way I could carry was open carry lawfully, well, then that's what I would be doing. But fortunately, I'm not in that position. And because I'm not in that position, my practice is to carry only concealed, at least outside the home, outside the office. I mean, in those domains, it doesn't make any difference really. But out in public, only concealed carry for me. Not knocking people who open carry. If that's what you want to do, fine. Constitution says you're privileged to do that. Frankly, it says you're privileged to do that everywhere, even where the local laws say it's not permitted. But I can assure you the local laws will put you in prison if you violate their local laws, regardless of what the Constitution may allow. All right, folks, we're down to the last couple of minutes. I had one more video. Maybe I'll play it sometime in the future if this one doesn't, if my account doesn't get suspended for copyright violation. We'll see what happens. Let's see. Rich says, there seems to be almost no chance you're not getting screwed if a gun is involved. Well, I guess I would phrase it slightly differently. Once a gun is involved, you are at high risk of getting screwed. You may not get screwed, but you are now at risk of getting screwed. The moment you bring the gun into play, you've opened the door for very easily made arguments that have to meet very low legal thresholds to find yourself immersed in a world of legal trouble. No matter how justified your use of force or threat of force or display of a gun may have actually been, you've opened that door. So I urge people to not open that door unless you really have to. And if you really have to, well, then arguably the legal risk is worth it, right? Because presumably at that point, life is at stake. It would be nice if we lived in a world where these things were not that ambiguous, but frankly, prosecutors have enormous discretion. It's discretion that I think in the hands of a good prosecutor can be very well used. That's been the norm in American history. In the hands of a politically motivated prosecutor, it's absolutely devastating to anybody in their crosshairs. And unfortunately, that's really a political question, not a use of force law question. I wish it was different. Not much I can do about this. Not much I can urge you to do, except, if you don't know who your prosecutor is, maybe you ought to. If you don't know who's running against them, maybe you ought to. That's kind of on us as the electorate. All right, folks, that's it. We're at the top of the hour. I'm going to wrap this up. Again, thank you for joining me. Come back every week, virtually every week, Thursdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Time here on Facebook if you're a Law of Self-Defense member, on your Law of Self-Defense member dashboard. And remember, if you carry a gun so that you're hard to kill, that's certainly why I carry a gun, so I'm hard to kill, so my family is hard to kill, then you also owe it to yourself and your family to make sure you know the law so that you're hard to convict. All right, folks, until next week or sooner, if you become a Law of Self-Defense member, you can do that for 99 cents, 2-week trial, 200% money back guarantee at lawofselfdefense.com/trial. So I urge you to try that out, see all the other content that we have. If you don't like it, just get your money back. Low risk, negative risk opportunity, really, lawofselfdefense.com/trial. But until next time, till we meet again, I urge all of you to please stay safe.